Yeah, so basically, we were thrilled to read your book, the Woodchip Handbook. It's the first complete guide to using wood chips. And like Dana said to you earlier, it's just basically it's really hard to find people that are so passionate about wood chips as we are. And so we were really excited to when your book came out, and wood chips are finally getting the fame that they deserve. In your book, you discuss a few of the people that recognize the power of wood chips, especially that they can add to a growing system, like Paul Gauchi does in our documentary Back to Eden. So we know that Back to Eden gardeners are going to love reading your book and having it in hand. And basically, the question that we get asked the most by everyone is, what are the best wood chips? And so we have our own answer to that, but we would love to hear what your answer is based on your research and what you share in your book.
There's no wrong answer, of course.
Yeah, well, I think that's the first step, isn't it? There isn't that, it depends a little bit, as all good questions do. It depends a little bit on what you want to use it for. And I think also we still don't know enough about how single species wood chips react. And I think that's one of the big things that came out as I was researching the book. There's a few things that we know about a few species, but there's so much that we still don't know. So when it comes to what's the best wood chip, I mean, often it's whatever you can get hold of, I would say. um, if you're not able to produce your own wood chip, you're often not in a position to choose, and actually mostly that's fine. Um, the other question then is whether you want a hard or a soft wood, which will depend a little bit on how long you want a mulch to work, or whether you're using it for raised vegetable beds, for instance, where you might want something that's a bit more broken down and composted. Or the other thing is the size of the chip. So do you want a really big lumps or small stuff? And again, it depends a little bit. So if you want it to last a long time, then the bigger the chip, the longer it will last. So yeah, lots of answers in some ways, but
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that you shared was that of the new things that were discovered kind of like recently was about the different species of trees that are nitrogen fixing in their own property. And then that was new to us reading that information in your book.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit about that?
So this, I think, is an area of massive potential. So a lot of vegetable growers will be relying on legume clovers and vetches and things to build their fertility, particularly. And there's a growing number of these, particularly for growers that don't want to use any animal inputs. And so typically you're relying on those sort of long-term fertility lays to build that up. But there are quite a lot of trees, like Robinia, like sea buckthorn, like alder, that will fix nitrogen. And uh, by incorporating them into your growing system, you can use the wood chip, but also when you say you coppice them, which is quite a good way of producing wood chip, you're releasing bits of nitrogen back into the soil as you coppice, and little bits of the roots die off. So there's a real, I think, a massive opportunity to build fertility through growing trees. You get obviously all the benefits that those trees give you for windbreaks and biodiversity and all of that stuff, as well as a potentially renewable source of fertility.
That's such a great answer. And yeah, I did think that that was, we're always looking for, like you said, there's not a lot of in-depth, long-term, reputable studies of wood chips. So there needs to be more, but all of our audience is constantly trying to find out the new information. So anything that, that's why your book is great. It's the first really in-depth, complete guide to gardening and landscaping with wood chip. And like you said, there's so much more to learn, but there is a lot of new information in it that really hasn't been talked about, and widespread knowledge. So I think that people will really appreciate that. And one of the
And I
things
think,
that,
I mean, I was just going to say on that, one of the things that really interests me in my work, because most of my work is done with commercial farmers and growers, but I really love working at that interface between um, larger scale and then home growers, and often that knowledge doesn't get transferred. And maybe you're going to mention this, but the work of David Granatstein, who's done a lot of work on mulches in commercial orchard systems that are just so applicable to even just one tree. And often that just sort of sits in a study, or it sits with a group of farmers that have done it. So
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that there's a lot of there's information like that in farmers who have been doing this on more of a commercial scale that people don't really ever talk about that. Like it's not, people are mostly thinking about small backyard garden scale or landscaping of pathways. But of course, doing orchards and perennials is definitely an easy application of wood chips. So you don't have to worry about the seeds germinating and sort of those issues. And on that note, kind of like the most popular way with our audience, at least, to use wood chips is for mulching, not tilling them in, but allowing them to be on the surface of the soil. And we kind of wanted you to reiterate what you have experienced the benefits of mulching with wood chip are for specifically growers of any scale.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a sort of couple of obvious ones. So, you mentioned already the fact that it keeps weeds down and stops weeds germinating, which it will do. I mean, it doesn't prevent perennial weeds coming up. In fact, once they get up, it provides a nice surface for them to grow really well with no competition. So there's no easy answer to perennial weeds, but it certainly, is really good at controlling annual weeds. It holds moisture in, and certainly that's where it wins out massively over flame weeding or herbicides, which just effectively leave a bare earth. So typically it will reduce irrigation needs by 25%. Increases, you get a quarter more water basically in your soil. There's also some really interesting stuff that we're starting to learn about some of those biological interactions. For instance, we did this trial with willow wood chip on apple trees, and the salicylic acid in willow, which is aspirin effectively, seems to stimulate an immune reaction in trees that boosts their ability to resist disease. So there was a trend towards less scab in the apples that had the willow wood chip. So there's some really interesting stuff around that. And the other thing, depending on your climate, is the wood chip mulch will modulate temperature, so it'll buffer against extremes of temperature. So typically, it slows the soil warming down on hot days, and if you get really cold days, it can increase the temperature by up to 10 degrees under a mulch. And most soil organisms don't like those extremes of temperature either. They're most active somewhere in the middle. So the more you can protect your soil from really hot or really cold conditions, then the healthier it's going to be, the higher the soil biology.
Yeah, one of the things that we've noticed too is that there hasn't been enough focus or research done on the benefits wood chips have as basically like a soil health amendment, and you go into that in your book. So we were wondering if you could talk about the role wood chips play as a soil health amendment.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing actually that came out really strongly in David Granatstein's work is, you compare it, if you're just looking at it as a weed control, then it's quite expensive, potentially. Or if you just look at it as a way of holding in moisture, then it's quite expensive. But it does all of these things. And as you say, it boosts soil health. And in particular, it boosts the soil fungi. So bacteria typically struggle to break down wood chip. It's too hard, the lignin in the wood is too hard for them to enter mostly. So it's fungi that we rely on to compost wood chip. And effectively, by chipping it, you're making it easier for fungi to get into. It's like a sort of fast food meal for them. So you're immediately boosting fungi soil populations, and then the spores are everywhere. So as soon as you put wood chip down, they're immediately being colonized by a whole range of fungi. And there's a sort of concept of this fungal bacterial ratio, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know about in soil, where as soils get older, they tend towards a more fungally dominated soil, which the more complex plants, shrubs, and trees prefer. And the more we disturb a soil, which sort of you have to do when you farm or garden, but the more you disturb it, the lower the fungal content comes, because fungi don't like being disturbed, and they don't like having fungicide sprayed on them, and all of these things that we do to soil to try and get a crop to establish. So the more we can not disturb it, and the more we can build the soil fungi, the happier some of those more complex plants are going to be in it. So
I think that's really interesting that, we've come across some of that as well in our research, that basically most other mulches don't have the ideal carbon and beneficial properties to promote fungi growth the same way that a wood chip mulch does. And I found that to be a pretty interesting part of your book as far as actually cultivating and growing your own mushrooms with wood chips, that I think our audience would be interested in learning more about your experience with that.
Well, yeah, I confess I'm still quite at the beginning of my journey in growing mushrooms. I'm not at all a mushroom expert, but it's fascinating because you think, well, you put wood chip down and comes in, so it must be good for growing mushrooms. So why can't we grow ones that we can eat? And wood chip is a great medium for growing a lot of different species of mushroom. I think when you start to do it outside, it gets more complicated. And it's certainly talking to some experts about it. My initial thing, well, just throw it down, it'll be fine. I think to do it really well and successfully, you need a bit more care and consideration probably. And certainly the outdoor trials that I've done under the trees haven't worked very well. And I think it might be that my trees are still a bit small, so they're not creating enough shade really to create those ideal conditions. But I have grown the mushrooms in bags of wood chip in the garden really successfully, where I've got a bit more control over it and I can sort of keep it moist and put it in the north facing wall so that it's always in shade. So I think, and again, it depends a bit on the species of mushroom. So I was doing the King Stropharia, which is the wine cap, which is quite vigorous. I think that it's called like the beginner's mushroom, isn't it? So it's quite easy to grow. It's quite foolproof because there's two things. One is a lot of the edible mushrooms are not the most vigorous strains. So if you just sort of spread them about outside, there's lots of other wild mushrooms that will come in and outcompete them, and you end up effectively with nothing. The other problem is, unless you really know what you're doing with mushrooms, you can harvest the wrong ones and kill yourself or someone else. Uh, Whereas the wine cap is very distinctive and not like anything else. I thought, well, I'll start with that.
Smart.
Yeah, it's definitely important. We don't want to be killing ourselves trying to eat.
But yeah, I love that you touched on the fact too of the importance of not tilling or disturbing the soil because it breaks that up. I think that's for us was like something that we didn't go into in the documentary maybe as much as we should have, but that a lot of people write in and are like, what is this white stuff that's in my soil? And like these mushrooms that are coming up, was this a bad sign? And that I think that's like, for me, it's like one of the reasons to really like promote, in addition to wood chips, is definitely not to disturb the soil, that they go hand in hand, I think. And I was wondering if you agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and I mean, as a general rule, I think the less you can disturb soil, the better. I mean, clearly there are some crops that you have to pretty much. So it's very hard to grow carrots without disturbing the soil at all. But again, I think there's some real opportunities using very well composted wood chip almost as a potting compost. So you can do a strip of it on the ground and sow into that almost without disturbing the soil at all. And I think we're starting to learn the power of undisturbed soil. And certainly, you read the old gardening books where it's all double digging and definitely written, I think, by people who enjoyed digging than people that really understood soil. Um, but finding a way to do that without any additions is hard. And I think often, as you said, things like manure or green compost are not necessarily the right material. And I don't know about in the States, but in the UK, a lot of the green compost is not great quality. It's got quite a lot of plastic in it, and even this sort of aminopyralid weed killer. So it's a risky substance to use, a risky input to have on your farm or garden. So I think finding a safer wood chip uh, method, I think, is really good.
Actually, I think that's a really good point that you brought up with the toxins or pesticides, herbicides that might be in a compost or mulch source. That we actually get that question quite frequently as well of how do I know if a tree has been sprayed, or is this going to be a safe material? And we kind of always tell people, check in with your tree trimming service to make sure that you can ask those questions and have a transparency. So it's a pretty clean material in general, and you can have a pretty direct supply chain with the source. Have you found that that is true where you are as well, or is there a problem with having clean wood chips?
I would say generally I would agree. I think mostly certainly the relationship we have is with two local tree surgeons, and we know them, and they come and drop on the farm, and that's fine. I think in some urban areas it might be harder, or if you don't, if you can't get hold directly of the tree surgeon, it might be harder. There's certainly a risk with some of the less reputable products that there might be sort of old pallets or painted wood in them. So you do have to be a bit careful from that point of view. I think generally, if it's come from a tree or a tree surgeon, it's unlikely to have been sprayed. There's not many things that trees are sprayed for. So from that point of view, it's pretty safe. I think the risk comes from contaminated wood entering into the supply chain, which, yeah, again, I think you can mitigate against, as you say, by certainly mostly by talking to the tree surgeon. So.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And yeah, we always recommend people get them from the tree trimming services or tree surgeons, not to use waste materials like plywood or anything like that. And yeah, kind of, I was actually curious. You mentioned Back to Eden in the book, the documentary that we produced, and we were kind of like, wow, like that's awesome. We were excited to see that. We were kind of curious, just kind of on a personal side note, what your impression of Back to Eden was like after watching the film. Did it influence you or your growing in any way? Do you do it differently?
So I don't do it exactly the same, although it's very similar. And I guess I'm mostly working at the moment anyway. I'm mostly working with trees and tree planting. So I'm not doing that much vegetable growing at the moment. And I suspect if I was, I would be doing it more closely similar. Um, but I think it was to answer the question about the influence. It was one of the things that sort of seemed to coalesce around the writing of the book. So there were a number of things that pushed me into thinking or realizing that there was a lot more to wood chip than I had kind of understood. So, like many people, I suspect I'd been using it on paths for years, and occasionally as a mulch for my potted plants and things, but I hadn't really thought beyond that. And there were a number of things. So the work of David Granatstein was one thing that I mentioned. There's a grower over here called Ian Tolhurst, who's an amazing vegan organic grower who he's done a lot of this stuff using it as a propagation compost and spreading composted wood chip as a soil health booster. So seeing his soils and hearing him talk about it was another thing that kind of pushed me. And reading sort of Linda Chalker Scott and seeing the Back to Eden, and so just a whole load of things. And then the final sort of big push, I guess, which again is in the book, is in 2018, which in the UK anyway was a really hot, dry year, and we planted a whole load of trees, and at the same time we pollarded some big old willows that we've got on the farm running along a stream, and sort of thought, oh, we need them for mulching. So we threw the wood chip over the fence into a big pile around some of the trees with the intention of going back and, moving it and spreading it out. And then other jobs took over and we never got back to it. And the trees that had the mulch, and this is a mulch that was about 2.5 foot deep. So it was deeper than you would normally recommend. But would just grew amazingly. And the ones that didn't have the mulch barely grew. Now, it was a really hot, dry year. But to the point now, so I went back and had a look at them a couple of weeks ago. The trees that didn't have the mulch or that only had a really thin mulch are still only up to about my waist, and this is 4 years later. The ones that had that thick mulch are about 14 foot tall.
Wow.
Um, and I just thought, okay, this is definitely worth using this more. So we now, we put much thicker layers of mulch on every tree. We really invest in it, and it seems expensive, and it's often difficult to get hold of the wood chip, but the establishment we get from planting trees with a really thick mulch is, I think, is worth the effort. If it's a fruiting tree, you probably get fruit a year or two earlier, and you almost certainly get higher yields. So you'll definitely get that time or money that you spend putting it on back in terms of better growth and better yields.
Right. Yeah. So, what would you recommend for people that were just putting in an orchard or fruit trees for the first time? How deep would you recommend that they put on the wood chips?
So I did, because I did quite. There actually, it's one of the one areas where there's quite a lot of studies that have been looked at depths and things of different materials, and my own experience, obviously. So I think it needs to be sort of 4 to 6 inches minimum depth for a tree mulch, and it depends a little bit on the type of wood. So something like willow, for instance, will break down really quickly. It's quite soft. Whereas something like oak or hornbeam is really hard and would last for 2 or 3 years. So you could probably get away with either a slightly thinner one, or certainly get away with only doing it once rather than sort of every sort of year or two at the start. So yeah, I think it needs to be, I would say, 6 to 8 inches probably if you've got enough chip, and ideally about sort of 3 or 4 foot in diameter, or yeah, in diameter, so sort of a couple of feet on each side of the tree. But it does come down a little bit to how much you've got, and how much time you've got to spread it, how many trees you've got. But also just being careful not to let it touch the bark of the tree. So just sort of push it away, because it can get a bit wet and rot the trunk if you're not careful.
Yeah, that
Although
definitely.
that didn't happen on the willow, but
It
then
didn't.
willow will root all the way up. So
Okay.
Yeah, like you said, even the extreme temperatures that you experienced the year that you kind of almost by accident discovered the benefits of the wood chip, that's just such a huge issue that, is obviously really relevant in the conversation about how we're growing our food and how we can help mitigate the extreme weather and climate changes that so many farmers are facing. So when we talk about the cost or investment of time or the material, I mean, it's very evident, like you said, that in order to actually have high yields and a food supply that we can have be resilient, it's worth the investment. But I was kind of curious that you've mentioned the cost of it a couple times. That here, it's still pretty. It's gotten more popular where you do kind of have to make a suggested donation to the tree trimming service in order to really get a wood chip load timely in some areas. Some areas I've heard you can pay as much as 200 for high demand wood chip loads. What is it like in your area as far as what you're paying? Are people getting free wood chips there still, or is that not really able to happen
I,
anymore?
no, I think a lot of people still are. I've heard there are some areas where it's now you can't. So there's one area where they said, oh, actually, we just can't get hold of any free wood chip anymore. There's areas where you have to wait, or you can't get as much as you want. I mean, again, we're lucky with the farm I'm working. We happen to have two tree surgeons sort of in the next village, and it's really convenient. And we've got a nice concrete pad for them to drive in and easily dump. So it depends a little bit on your access. But I think, I mean, since I've started writing the book, I think it's got slightly harder to get hold of. And obviously now the book's out, it'll be gold dust. But I mean, in some ways, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, obviously, it's a shame if you want free chip, but for it to be a valued resource, I think is good. I think it should encourage more trees to be planted for that purpose and be managed as part of a, wider, more diverse food system. So I think it's a good thing. I think compared still to the amount of wood chip that goes into biomass burners, probably the amount that's going into soil and gardens is negligible. So I think that's where we need to steal from.
Yes. Definitely agree. And yeah, compared to when we've had loads of, organic compost delivered versus the mass that you get for a wood chip load, it's like 4 to 10 times the amount of cost here. So for compost versus a wood chip load. So it's still pretty affordable. So the kind of one of the closing questions that we wanted to ask were some of the biggest challenges that you have faced using wood chips, and what are your proposed solutions?
So challenges. So I think the challenge, and again, bearing in mind that a lot of this is based on some of my work with farmers rather than gardeners. I think for gardeners, the only real challenge is getting hold of it and having somewhere to put it. So a lot of, at home, for instance, I have a small garden. and I don't have somewhere that someone could come and tip a load. So I would be reliant on, a ton bag, or, as it is, I, squirrel it away as I come back from the farm in bags. But so I think it's a logistical problem. I think if you're mostly for gardeners, I think for farmers, it's actually just the cost of spreading it. So when I talk about the cost, there's part of it is the cost of actually getting hold of the material. Part of it is the cost of applying it on a commercial scale, and certainly for mulching. It's so cheap to whiz up a row with a knapsack sprayer or a tractor mounted sprayer and just spray off every tree. um, it's hard to even get people to think that the amount of money you have to pay someone to mulch every tree is worth it. And in some row systems you can get machinery. So in orchards you can get machine side discharge machines that will make that job easier. But in forestry or in woodlands, it's all narrow. It's narrow planting. You can't get the machines in, so you're really relying on little tractors and trailers, and you know people shoveling it out, which is fine if you've got 30 trees, but if you've suddenly got to plant 5,000, you go, what, really? um, in my view, is you're still better off doing that. And we're slowing our tree planting strategy down in the farm that I'm working on. So we did have it's mainly a livestock farm. It's in the southwest of England, called Eastbrook Farm. And we're planning to plant 200 acres of agroforestry, so effectively incorporating trees into 200 acres of fields that didn't have trees previously. And we had intended to do that over 5 or 6 years. And we're now year 6, and we've only done 80 acres of it. And that's quite deliberate because we want the trees that we're planting to survive. And we realize that we need to take enough care of the ones we're planting. And we're better off planting half the number every year, really mulching them, really looking after them, make sure they establish, than going, right, we're going to plant everything, and then realize that half it's died and we've got to go back and replant it all. And so actually planting a few trees really well and making sure they grow quickly and grow well is likely to be a better strategy. But it's not one that's easy to communicate to governments with tree planting targets, or carbon offsetters who want to plant trees in the ground. They want to say they've planted 10,000 trees. They don't want to say, well, we planted 500 and we're going to do another 500 next year. So that, yeah, it's an interesting challenge, but I think kind of in the life of a tree, what's a year or two?
Yeah, right. That's so interesting. That I really appreciate all of that, because we really haven't talked to a lot of people who are doing it on the scale that you're even trying to incorporate it on. And I've definitely seen examples and heard of Ian Tolhurst, who hopefully we have the chance to talk to as well, and different ways people are making this work. But I appreciate that after your experience, that it is quality over quantity. And I do believe that people are going to see the value in that, maybe by the time that they're actually forced to see it because of the way that things are going with our food supply system. The more people that can start doing this kind of thing, the better quality that we can have people stewarding that type of growth system. So I really hope that encourages and inspires people, that your book is such a great resource. We really encourage all of the people who are still trying to understand how to get wood chips and the different ways that they can be used and want to learn more about it, to go out and get Ben's book. That we'll have the information below the interview, so people can get connected.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So we really appreciate your time, and we hope to stay connected as one of the new wood chip advocates of the world.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.